This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Eola Dance and Jennie K. Williams, co-founders and directors of the Kinfolkology project, which explores a complex intersection of data, memory, and descendant communities in the history of enslavement. Eola Dance is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Howard University, and Jennie K. Williams is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. In this conversation, we explore the meaning of data for history, how memory of the enslaved is both inside and outside data, and what obligations curators of slavery's data have to descendant communities. Good morning, Eola and Jennie. How are you all today?
Doing well. Good morning.
Doing great. Thank you.
I'm really so excited that we found time to get you both on the podcast and to talk about the Kinfolkology project. Been following the project for a while and spent a lot of time on the website, which is just a really amazing project. And it does the kind of work that I think is so essential to Black studies. Not only doing an immense documentary work, historical work, community work, but also being public facing in all of these ways, while also being a deeply intellectual and archival project. It's just, in some ways, for me, when I was looking at it, I thought this is really sort of the best that we hope for in Black studies. And so, I had you all on the list, and I was so happy when you cheerfully said yes to be on. So welcome, and just a special thanks for taking time out to talk about it.
Thank you so much.
So we'll have a chance to talk, obviously, about the project and hear how you all think about the kind of work that you do and its relationship to the history of similar work. It strikes me this is really kind of between archival work and activist work, and that's so interesting to me. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you both, what, as archivists, activists, scholars, what drew you to work on Black life? What were those formative experiences? And I mean that in the whole human sense, educational, personal, political, cultural. What led you to the study of Black life? And what, for me, is always an interesting question, what keeps you committed? And maybe start with you, Eola.
Well, thank you so much, especially for that question. I think it was, just being on a journey and trying to understand my family history. I grew up in a military family, away from my grandparents, or particularly my grandmothers, who lived in Louisiana, and I grew up in Virginia. My father retired as a lieutenant colonel, and I was also a retirement baby. And so I didn't move around like my siblings. I know a lot of folks understand what that's like. So I was always trying to understand where we were from, who we are, and our origins. And we had very specific culture around food and around music. And I wanted to better understand that. And that led me to go to undergrad in Louisiana. But even before that, I was in this household where history was kind of always around us, but we weren't overwhelmed by it. There were all of these, historical figure, like trading cards and posters. And, we were encouraged to read ahead in our school book and take interesting things that my parents had acquired as they traveled or sponsored soldiers from West Africa, like to school as show and tell. And so there was an awareness that led me to my first job, which was at a cultural bookstore. I was 16. And then later to visual art. So I thought I would be an artist, but anyone who's ever pursued art, you participate in all of these studies of Van Gogh and, Monet. And I felt like I wanted to express something that was in my head, but I needed to understand it better. And it was about African American experience. And so I actually majored in history, and I've been doing history now for over 20 years. And one day I'll get back to art. But my journey has very much so been about self-discovery, family discovery, and expression.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, that's also it strikes me that I mean, I'll ask you all in a minute, sort of how you even not how you even, but how you characterize the Kinfolkology project, but it has a design element, which is that
Hmm.
moment of art, and art and history is, I think, have a closer relationship than sometimes we give it credit for. But art per se, yeah, that's a different thing. So, Jenny, how about you?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, and thank you again for having us. Exciting to be on a podcast that I listen to myself. Um, I guess to start at the beginning, I mean, as soon as I could read, was pretty fixated on history as a kid. I joke about this, but I think it's also true that it's not unrelated to having psychologists for parents. Um, And so for me, historical inquiry is always felt somewhat excuse me, felt somewhat like a, cultural introspection and personal
Mm,
introspection.
mhm,
Um, and, in the same vein, family has always been a big part of my life, and those 2 things I think were always, bound to collide at some point. And so the first sort of awareness I had of my family, as historical actors, I think came from, the knowledge, or the discovery my discovery anyway, other people knew, of course, that we had family killed in the Holocaust on my dad's side. And then later on, learning a little bit about the history of slavery, and sort of the dawning realization, that I'm descended, at least in part, from enslavers. I'm also descended from abolitionists. And so I guess my inheritance is complicated in that way. Um, but I think my decision to pursue a doctorate, in African American history specifically, was born out of an awareness of that sort of ancestral inheritance I described. And while I don't feel, responsible for the sins of my ancestors, I do feel responsible for everything I've inherited from them, and
mhm.
everything we've all inherited, from all of our ancestors. And so for me, my work is a way of contributing to a reckoning that I think of as necessary and important, and a reckoning that I feel, ethically, bound to be part of. Um, and I guess the focus, particularly on kinship in my work, which is a big theme in the book I'm supposed to be finishing, and a big theme of kinfolkology, is probably not unrelated to my awareness that my family history is, in part at least, the history of grotesque violence done to other families, and so I have always had a sort of desire for my work to be reparative, specifically in terms of kinship.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting. And maybe also just use that as a way of asking you then, sort of how would you characterize the Kinfolkology project? I mean, I said, and I want to ask hear what you have to say as well, Yola, of course. When I was looking at it and thinking about this podcast, I had a hard time sort of characterizing it, because it's archival work, but it's also activist work. It's historical work, but it's also deeply political and ethical. And, you sort of walked right up to the project there. And I'm interested in how you understand the project, how you describe it.
Well, as I was introduced to Jenny, what brought us together was that merging of a Virginia history and a Louisiana history, or you could say a Mid-Atlantic history and a Louisiana history. My family is likely in represented in the documents that Jenny has brought together in the database Oceans of Kinfolk. And for me, that was part of a healing opportunity in 2 ways. One, my mother is 90 and asked once, could you do this research on our family history? Like Jenny, I'm an academic, so I'm in graduate school. I have all kinds of other projects. I also had a career in public history, and I thought, yes, it's on the list of things I would love to be able to do one day. But I also had that awareness of the silences in the archive, violences in the archive that destroyed documents. And I had a worry that I would never be able to actually tell my mother a more complete history of our ancestor, Priscilla Johnson. However, upon meeting Jenny and thinking about how we could bring our work together, I learned that there are 7 Priscillas in the database, and 2 of them could be the age of my ancestor who was trafficked from Virginia to Louisiana, particularly New Orleans, based on our family history. So in our family's oral tradition, it potentially matches up with this primary documentation. And so for me, that represented a healing opportunity. And then the other is how we express it. So in my family, we also have a number of scholars and storytellers, and we're thinking about how we might create a digital archive. And Kinfolkology is designed to do exactly that. And I would love to say, that was a bright idea that I had, but I tend to work in physical spaces and places as a public historian. And so in working with Jenny and bringing our ideas together, we've really created Kinfolkology as a way to create this digital space that can be healing, much like a pilgrimage to Point Comfort, where first Africans landed in 1619, or to other places of memory associated with the long, history of African American experience and the slave trade. So I don't know, Jenny, if that characterizes oceans of kinfolk and Kinfolkology well. My side is the descendant work, but you've done such an amazing job in really, bringing humanity back to these records. I don't know if there's more you want to say about Kinfolkology.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this will just sort of build on what Eola is saying, but I think and I like that you chose activism, and archival work as the frameworks for Kinfolkology because I think it fits, and it fits in terms of, I think, what we're trying to do is really push, for data to be used differently than it has been in the past, and I guess in a lot of respects that is activist work. It's also activist work about the archive that is data, or data as the archive. And I think that it's worth reflecting a little bit on how we got here, in order for it just to explain why a project like this seemed to us at least to be necessary. And that is that data in slavery have a complicated and painful history. And we know that from the inception of quantitative methods, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of scholars used computers and data and statistics to ask questions that maybe were not the most humanizing questions to ask, and maybe not at the forefront of many descendant communities' minds when they were looking for information about their ancestors. And so I think that the the academy that Eola and I have come into, as relatively young scholars, is somewhat data averse for very good reasons, because data has done a lot of harm. And so I think the role of a project like Kinfolkology is to think twice about these methods that we are, as a field, pretty queasy about, and see how can we use these quantitative, computational, data science methods to do work contrary to the original record. So the work of reunification of kin, the work of empowering descendants as stewards of the archive, in ways that contravene traditional limitations of the archive in terms of access and ownership, and stewardship and sovereignty. And so that is how I think we often think of Kinfolkology. And I commend you on your framework choice, because I think that sums it up well.
I'm glad that it did resonate. I've really struggled to find the right words with that, how to characterize the project, and I mean that's why we talk, so that it has substance rather than 2 or 3 words. But I think that relationship between archive and activism, in the way that you all practice it, and you've spoken to it directly, has such deep um, ethical meaning, but
Mhm.
also spiritual meaning. I was really struck by that phrase, descendant communities. And it's a phrase I don't hear very often, and I would love to start hearing it, because I think it captures the human stakes of this kind of documentation. As you said, the accumulation of data and presentation of data. If you think about it solely in the context of descendant communities, rather than how have people used data in the past and how am I using it differently, those sort of what would you call, like, default kind of scholarly questions where we just talk to each other. I love talking to each other, but that the obligation of your project to descendant communities around questions of healing, around reunification, that just, for me, that dimension of activism is just really profound and human. So that's just a long way of saying, like, thank you for the project that way, because I think it was going to lead a lot of people who listen to this and go look at the project, if they haven't seen it already, will really ask questions about our own work, right? How can we have this kind of ethical dimension in our own work? That's not a new imperative for Black studies. That was its origin point, right?
Mhm.
Mm.
That it was, intellectual work and political work go hand in hand. And that political work is human. It's not just mobilization and voting or something like that. So, yeah.
I very much so agree with that. Most of my career was at national parks, historic sites, archives, and the like. And one of the phrases that really stuck out to me was essentially that museums are not neutral. Um, in as an early, preservationist, I think there was this idea that in some way we were just presenting the facts.
Mm.
And I would say, when it comes to the work of kinfolkology, we very much so plan and prepare for the emotional experience that one has, whether it's the practitioner in the archive or the audience, the community that we're engaging with. And so we've actually included subject matter experts who are experienced in trauma and approaches that help you with all of the emotions that you might have. And that's foundational to the work. And so I view a level of activism in terms of our mission in uh, reparations and structural parity, which is about governance and about atonement, but also in acknowledging that this is emotional work, and it's about people and it's about real families and histories. Sometimes that were separated and never reconnected, and other times that the stories and the trauma represented in the stories could be a further harm. And so that's what's been really encouraging about the collaboration between Jenny and I is in seeking to do, no further harm and preparing for those emotional experiences that we all have.
Mhm.
I mean, it's been a theme that's come out across this podcast, talking with historians who work in the antebellum period or the transatlantic slave trade, Caribbean, Latin America, the intense emotional event that is this research. And it's, hearing you talk about it, and it does also make me just think so much about how, when I have had those conversations, or when I listen to my collaborator Ashley have those conversations with historians, I think there's a lot of expressions of I don't know what the right word would be, but I mean, they're not trained in that
Hmm.
dimension, right? They're trained
Hmm.
in documentation, but when the documentation has such an existential effect, right? And it is inevitably. I mean, I just think this is on a separate podcast that I work on with a graduate student of mine, Fatima Sek, Conversations in Atlantic Theory. Was talking with Mary Hicks, who's an historian at University of Chicago, came out with the book on 18th century mariners, African mariners, and she was just talking about just the exhaustion of working in these archives, and just it's just a list of atrocities. But how do you reckon with that? Obviously, that's the scholar as an ethical person, but as you meant, saying there is that scholar as a human being who's
Yeah,
encountering that.
absolutely.
Yeah. And so this is a way for me of maybe couching this question a little bit, and maybe start with you, Jenny, to ask about in the archival and activist practice of kinfolkology, what's the role of study? I mean, obviously, you're both have academic training and all of that. So I mean that sort of what is the role of study there, but also what more widely is the role of study around thinking about ethics, around thinking about community, around thinking about healing as a practice. Jenny?
Yeah, so I guess in a sort of literal way, kinfolkology grew out of both Eola and my our studies. So, in my sense, Oceans of Kinfolk is the database that I first compiled during my doctoral work at Johns Hopkins between 2015 and 2020. And then my dissertation and now book manuscript tells the story that's or the many stories that are represented in that data, which is the history of the coastwise traffic enslaved people to New Orleans in the antebellum era, which you might think of as the maritime portion of the domestic traffic of enslaved people in the United States. And so, in one sense, kinfolkology is an effort to take this academic history and relate it to living people and make it accessible to living people, and also um, to do that same work for data. I often phrase it as, Oceans of Kinfolk is what we call a relational database, and it's called that because um, in a relational database, all the information, all the variables have to have some sort of relationship with one another. But what we forget, I think, is that relational databases, in order to have any sort of meaning outside themselves, need to relate to human beings too. And so that's the work of kinfolkology, I think. Um, Study, I guess, is also relevant to what we're doing in terms of training young scholars in the work of digital methods and dissident engagement. Um, and also broadly, that we hope that the sort of methods and ethos that we are outlining together will be useful to scholars working on any number of projects. So right now, kinfolkology is sort of built around two data sets. Oceans of Kinfolk, which we've already described, and then Louisiana Kindred, which is a developing database of enslaved people who were sold in antebellum New Orleans. And then we're working on a third database, which is a different sort of database, but one of remembrance built from family archives. But by no means do we think that structural parity or descendant-led stewardship of data are ideas that are only applicable to this particular consortium of data. And so, we hope that kinfolkology will be a model useful to other scholars working in different areas of study. And also, we like to envision a digital component of Eola's research on the evolution of racial slavery in Virginia one day as well.
Eola, how about you? How does study factor function in how you think about this project?
Well, as Jenny just shared, my entree into this conversation is related to the evolution of racial slavery in Virginia, 1619. And at one time, and this is going to get to the study part, I thought, oh, I want to inquire about the first three generations of captive Africans in Virginia. And as I began my studies, which are at Howard University, in progress, hoping to defend a dissertation within the next year, I realized, well, I have to carry people through codification of slave law, so I need to expand to 1705. And then as I continued to work, and especially in these current times, I realized, well, the first opportunity this nation had to really atone for uh, enslavement of captive Africans is really during the American Revolution,
Mhm.
and thereafter, and we did not. And so my studies have helped me to really think differently about the making of America. And it has also helped me to think differently about what we've called invisible founders. And so the many enslaved people who made it possible for individuals like, or, founding leaders like James Madison to sequester himself in a library and study, government by the people. You know, at least 100 enslaved people were there at Montpelier at the time when those ideals were considered, and the Virginia Plan then becomes the Constitution, and so on. And so for me, study is very much so about my understanding, as well as how I engage others in understanding history. And it has helped me to think about how family histories and the descendants of enslaved people exploring their family history as part of nation building narrative. And that then makes the archive even more important as we're bringing together oral traditions and primary sources and creating a more complete, what we like to call whole history. And so for me, that's where the activism and active part of study, collides.
I love both of those responses as really, really rich and thoughtful. Thank you. I mean, there are these moments in these podcasts where I'm like, the whole podcast is worth it for those responses. I mean, those are really fantastic. There's so much there to think about. And again, not to repeat myself, but there's so much about the imperative of Black studies to have this kind of meaning in our study that you've really articulated so well. And so maybe if I could follow up, Eola, with this next question, which is, and then Jenny, hear what you have to say. What do you think this work in kinfolkology says about Black life?
Well, one, it complicates it. I think that it's a multifaceted narrative that's about real people who loved, people who were loved, and have descendants who are longing for a better understanding of their experiences and contributions. And I think kinfolkology allows us to remember them in a way that honors them and includes them in that core narrative, in contrast to it being a marginal or separate history. They're at the center of the narrative and the history. And the descendant is part of that experience. It's not only looking back, but it's also active in honoring those of us present and here today, and how we're, making history and creating, and it's part of a continuum. And I think that, the kinfolkology is a jumping off point for so many more ways of engaging, whether it's through continued scholarship, community conversations and forums, or deeper study and inquiry into our approaches as a method in data ethics and dissident engagement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you. Jenny, how about you?
Um, so I think what this question has me thinking about is that kinfolkology reveals how central community and kinship are in activism. So, in terms of in the ways in which kinfolkology is an activist project, it would be through arguing for descendant data sovereignty and data stewardship. It would be in pointing to slavery's archive as evidence for crimes against humanity for which reparations are owed, and his for history as a discipline to engage living communities, and in all of those ways in which kinfolkology is pushing for change, it is through community and kinship, and that to me is so resonant of what I've seen in my research, where So, for example, another data project was I compiled a data set of every fugitive ad that I could find ever published in Maryland, which was about 11,000 advertisements and about 10,000 fugitives, since some people were advertised more than once. And what I expected to find was that most of the ads would be for people who we could speculate were fleeing north. What I found, which perhaps I should have seen coming, was that actually it was far more common for people to flee to Baltimore. And this, of course, is still a freedom struggle, but it's a freedom struggle for collective liberation, because that is reflective of the fact that people were seeking escape from slavery, but did not want to abandon everyone and everything they'd ever known by going to
Mhm.
Philadelphia, which is not too far. And so that, to me, is a sort of contrary freedom struggle that is reminiscent of the freedom struggles that we're trying to do now, right? But also then and now, very different than the kind of freedom struggle we think of as, quote, American, in terms of fighting for the individual liberty enshrined in our founding documents. My right to do this, my right to do that. And so to me, Black Life Now and Black Life Then has always revealed another vision for what freedom means.
Mhm.
And the role of community and family and kinship in articulating that vision.
No, that's super interesting, um, and maybe that's like a frame, thinking about these different kinds of freedom
Mhm.
struggles, which it's really the way that's embedded in this entire project as a sort of animating insight is hugely important. Thank you. Um,
Mhm.
I'm interested in maybe start with you, Jenny, about how you see the kind of archival and activist practice of kinfolkology, how you see it in relation to the history of similar practices, but
Mhm.
also to the future. And I think you've both spoken to this in some ways, but I wanted to sort of in that way re-ask the question. How do you see it like changing? And I'm thinking particularly black practices. You talked about
Mhm.
oral histories being so central, and it wasn't just going to be sort of governed by old data, sets in ways that were so alienating, but instead have this a descendant community as a centerpiece of the project. So obviously there's a history of these practices, and I'm interested how you see kinfolkology in relation to the history of those, but also how it's changing the future of such practices. And start with you, Jenny, and then you, Yola.
Yeah. Um, so this is um, thankfully, it's an easy question for me to reflect on, because in the course of my career, I've worked at a number of different projects that use data and quantitative methods. So the first edition of Oceans of Kinfolk was published at Slave Voyages. And as I'm sure we all know, Slave Voyages is a remarkable feat of digital scholarship, and in a lot of ways, the steward of data, arguably the greatest crime humans have ever committed against themselves, meaning the transatlantic slave trade. And so by no means do I mean to downplay the significance of that project, or the data it houses. But in being part of that project, I observed several um, ways in which I wanted a project that operated differently.
Hmm.
And so, for one, um, for us, I think our assumption is that data cannot be done in isolation of everything else. So data has to be reparative. And the reason it has to be reparative, and specifically reparative of kinship and community, is because the documents the documents used to produce the data were so violent, specifically towards, kinship and community, and the documents did the work of alienation. And so for us, the data has to be contrary to that alienation. Now, I think some scholars have interpreted that imperative, which of course I'm not the first to articulate, to mean that tabular data is perhaps irredeemable. Tabular quantitative computational work perhaps is irredeemable. And I know I personally spent a lot of time wrestling with the idea of whether data built from what we could likely call unethical sources, right? Slavery's archive, could be transformed in some way so that it's almost cleansed, or or if it's. And long story short, I think the answer is absolutely not. I think data built from slavery's archive is always going to be sort of cursed and harmful and dehumanizing. And what's more, I'm not sure that even if we could transform it, that we should, because then we would be lying about the harm done by this quote information.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
aside from that, most descendant communities that we have worked with anyway have a desire to see the original record and want to know what they say.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so to me, it seems almost condescending to say this data is too harmful for us to make accessible. Um, and so in that way, kinfolkology is a little different. Um, but I think that's all the more reason why the sort of computational approach and the spreadsheets have to be accompanied by community engaged work. And why the spreadsheets themselves have to be stewarded in community with descendants. And that is, I think, one way in which kinfolkology is trying to be different.
mhm,
I think in terms of how these methods relate to like now and how they might change or become more or less important. I think we are living through a time where the archive itself, I mean, slavery's archive has always been precarious. At any given moment, records in Louisiana could be washed away. And now, at any given moment, records can and probably are being destroyed. And so the work to me of of um, of data now is all the more urgent because this is information in slavery's archive is harmful and dehumanizing. Yes, it's also the only information we have.
mhm,
And so the ability of data to um, not solve the question of who owns the archive, but to just circumvent it for now, and to preserve information that we need for reckoning purposes and for genealogical purposes and for the purposes of finding enslaved ancestors. Data has a real role to play. And that is, I think, only going to become, um, unfortunately, more the case. And the last thing I'll say in terms of kinfolkology's innovations, I guess, or interventions in terms of data, is that one of the things we try to be very explicit about is our belief that data should be understood as an evidentiary basis for reparations.
hmm,
And this argument, we should note, is not operating in the realm of what should be. If we were operating in the realm of what should be, there would be reparations regardless of archival documentation for truths that we know, right?
mhm,
In other words, you wouldn't need archival documentation of an enslaved ancestor to be part of justice that is addressing slavery. But given the Supreme Court's ruling that, now, of course, the ruling was regarding affirmative action, but had broad implications in terms of stipulating that any sort of remedial program or reparative program broadly, whether it be affirmative action or reparations, would have to be narrowly tailored to specific historic injustices for which
mhm,
there is
mhm,
evidentiary proof. And is slavery's archive complete of all of the crimes against humanity that slavery represents? No, but it is something. And so I think if we are looking to start the work of reckoning and start the work of imagining reparations, then slavery's data is a good place to start.
Yola?
And adding to that, I would say the opportunity that's transformative in the archive is related to structural parity and our interest and commitment to shared authority with the descendants of the enslaved. And so that is that those who have ancestral ties or see themselves as connected to the history, to the collections, to the stories and individuals represented in the data that we have preserved, we're seeking to share authority with them. And so that's um, actually part of the design of the organization itself. It's part of the fabric of how we um, plan and bring people together in community. And it is most definitely central to how we plan to share the stories and create a digital archive and a space where the descendant is really part of the decision making throughout. And even further, from the exploration of the data that's associated with the history to the storytelling. Part of what we're looking to do is bring communities together for a forum, and in an academic pursuit of this work, in addition to it simply being community engagement events and the like. And so it's including the descendant in every aspect, and that to me is quite transformative in contrast to, again, my experience with the federal government and in nonprofits who have sought to engage typically tribal nations, and the African American community in what we've called hidden histories or untold stories, and have been challenged in the ways that legislation limits their ability to do so, or policy limits their ability to do so. But thankfully, with Kinfolkology, we're not limited in that way. So it also positions us to be an excellent partner with said organizations.
So, following up on that, the way the work with data, it's the conversation and meaning around it with communities. Um, it was really, I mean, it's amazing to hear that. I'm interested also, and I was thinking, Yola, when you said, you mentioned at the very beginning your background in art. Is there a curatorial dimension to this in terms of like how you make the data available? And Jenny, you said, we can't just run from the harm of you didn't say Excel sheet, but the
Yeah.
spreadsheet, right? But there's also this curatorial part of which is, of course, the curation of a community event rather than a website or a poster. But just to throw that word out there, like curation, is there an aesthetic like challenge for you all in Kinfolkology that requires another element of study, another element of thoughtfulness? I'm just interested to hear you talk about that, because the presentation of data, the design of information has such deep ethical and political meaning. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
start, Yola.
Yeah, I'll share just a bit and then, pass to Jenny, because this is also part of what has excited me so much about our collaboration with one another. Is I had spent considerable time thinking about and creating a methodology for the use of visual, performing, and literary art and helping people to connect with and understand difficult topics in social history. The piece I didn't have was the data piece, outside of traditional approaches in historiography, and so Kinfolkology very much so incorporates all of those layers and elements, and that's very much so part of how we help the descendant community or others. So not everyone who is engaged and involved in our work is a descendant of the enslaved, but they are engaging Black history, Black studies, the history of slavery, and working through their emotional reaction to that history. And so the carefully curated piece is in how we create an experience, whether it is at one of our workshops and gatherings, down to the details of the materials that represent the histories and stories told, or in how we ultimately build a digital memorial
Mm.
to the enslaved, and it being done so with individual families who determine how much of that story is shared publicly, how much of that story is just for them, and how do they convey that history, even when there's gaps in the historical record. It may be that they're sharing that story through song, through poetry, or some other creative means.
Yeah. First of all, I really love that we get to talk about aesthetics, because the aesthetics, to be totally transparent, have been a challenge for us because we, as a still relatively new project, have not had the funding for to hire professional artists or web designers. And so I built our website, and I've done all of the graphic design for the project. And it has been tricky because while I don't have the artistic skills and Eola is not a graphic designer either, what we do have is an understanding of the ethos of the project. And so, for example, we both felt very early on that water imagery should be part of the project, but that's very tricky, right? Water, as you know, is reminiscent of the Middle Passage and trauma, but water is also peace, and a lot of people feel a sort of almost familial attachment to water. And so how to incorporate that imagery into the site has been a challenge, but important. But the other thing that I want to say is that you are so right to notice that curation is part of the project. But what I want to point out is that it's often in direct opposition to our technological capabilities. And so one example of this, I mentioned that I learned a number of things from having the first edition of Oceans of Kinfolk, be it Slave Wages, and now, of course, the second edition is at Kinfolkology. And one of the differences you'll notice between the two editions of the database is that the original records are not available as Slave Wages. And that's true for, I shouldn't speak for all, last I checked, for all of the databases there. I mean, there might be some featured on the site, but they're not embedded into the tabular design of the database, right? And there's good reason for that. It is so complicated to embed thousands of PDFs or JPEGs or whatever you want to do into a database. It takes up a ton of room, and it's clunky. And that is why right now, Oceans of Kinfolk takes a while to load because I decided that I wanted the original records to be in every row. Every person needed to have the record on which they appeared next to their name. Now, that was an intentional decision for a number of reasons. One, as so many scholars have compellingly written about, when the information gathered from these records is abstracted from the records themselves. I'm thinking of Jessica Marie Johnson's work in particular, but that information becomes imbued with like facthood and objectivity and all of these really dangerous characteristics that if it's embedded on the original source, that quote information is not imbued with those things. So, for example, I have seen manifests that refer to human beings as quote bacon color. Now, if you just take that out and you make that a tabular point of data, it becomes almost a fact that person's race was, quote, bacon color. Well, which we know, and it's emphasized if you look at the record, how dehumanizing that is and how intentionally dehumanizing that is, and that it's this sort of subjective and problematic phenotypical description of a human being, right? But if it's not in the source, you kind of lose that. So that's one reason why I think it's important for data like Oceans of Kinfolk, Louisiana Kindred, and other databases that are built from these really problematic records to be transparent and sort of intellectually honest enough to say, here's the source this comes from, and have that embedded in the actual database. So now that is an act of curation, right? One reason the second edition of Oceans of Kinfolk is taking so long to finish is because I'm manually uploading every PDF for every more than 63,000 of the people in the database. That's a tedious task. It also is not what Airtable, which is what we're still using, is designed to do by any respect. And so it really butts against the two sort of imperatives of like technological efficiency and accessibility, and especially we want this site to be accessible in places with like limited Wi-Fi. Like all of these imperatives are sometimes directly opposed to the like curatorial imperatives and the ethical imperatives, and so it's a real balancing act to figure out how to do all of the things that we decided we want to do, and not something necessarily we've figured out. Airtable is not a permanent solution.
Yeah. Having used Airtable a little bit myself, I can't.
It's not made for this. It's not made for this.
But those are just I mean, the relationship between design and ethics is just so massive in these moments.
But it's good for that, right? One thing Airtable is good at, even compared to like so simple like Google Sheets, for example. Airtable will let you hover over a variable and have a description that pops up that says, we recognize the terminology in this variable is harmful and dehumanizing. Here's why we've chosen to transcribe it verbatim anyway. And like, that really matters. The color coding matters. The type that you can have different types of variables, where this variable is an attachment, this variable is a drop-down selection. That ends up mattering in ethical terms. I'll give just one example. For Louisiana Kindred, there is a variable that is called claimed orphan. And what that means is whether or not on the notarial record of sale a child was identified as being an orphan. Now, we didn't name that variable orphan, yes or no, because traders had an incentive to call children orphans who were not, because if they were, quote, orphans, they could legally traffic the children by themselves, meaning without parents, to Louisiana and sell them alone. And that law was passed. The law that outlawed trafficking children under 10 was passed in 1829. And so after 1829, you see, one, a spike in children who are reportedly 11, which was the cutoff age, and also a spike in children who are described as orphans in the records. So it was very important for the auctions for our researchers who were working on that database to only be able to select that the child was claimed as an orphan or have a null value. We couldn't, in other words, it was not, you'd get an error if you tried to enter in no, because we didn't want to imply that we had knowledge that we didn't have. And so the null value was important. And and that kind of where you can like set stipulations on what you enter the data, that's also an Airtable thing. So a lot of ways it's great, but it would be much better if we had a dedicated software engineer to design a custom interface for us, which perhaps one day.
I mean, there's an interesting, very broad question that you raise. And, we've had some digital humanities people on the series. And so maybe at some point we got to get a group of you all together to ask this question about the relationship between software and ethics, and the way it both enables and limits. I think it's an unexpected question for a lot of people, but once you start asking the kind of questions that you both have asked throughout this podcast and issues you've raised, all of a sudden I think, what software does and doesn't do all of a sudden has these enormous human implications. I love that. That's something that's so important to think about. So thank you both for really making that clear. And so let me ask a last question. In some ways, I think this last question has been answered by the previous 51 minutes and 17 seconds, looking at the clock. But I'll ask it anyway as a way of wrapping up, which is, what is the one issue or question you'd like to see artists, archivists, activists, scholars asking? And maybe start with you, Jennie, and then Eola.
I think you're right that I might have said this in a different way already, but I think for me, the past 20 years of scholarship on slavery's data has done the very important thing of establishing that slavery's data is dangerous and harmful, and that data is perhaps inevitably that way. Slavery's data is inevitably that way. I think the question for us to turn to now is, okay, but what do we do with it? In other words, Catherine McKittrick writes about the lists, but the lists are going to list. They do what they do. And the question I think that we need to turn to is, do we give up on quantitative methods? Do we give up on data? Or is there not an antidote perhaps, but is there a sort of, if data, then what? Right? Like, and what is the end of that equation? For us, the equation for now is, if data, then descendant engagement, right? This has to be an imperative. You can't do one without the other. But I certainly think that's a bigger question. That's a question for the field to decide, is like, how do we wield these powerful tools of quantitative analysis and data for good?
Eola.
My question is directly related to the descendant engagement piece. And I will share that I use a very broad definition of descendant. even broader than that we've alluded to earlier, which is rooted in the rubric that was created by Montpelier and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I use a definition of descendant that includes descendants of slaveholding families, descendants of the enslaved, of free Blacks, of Native Americans, those who are Native and Black, those who are descendant of immigrants or even recent immigrants, because we're all descended of someone. And the question I have for artists, activists, descendants, and those seeking truth is it okay to be uncomfortable for a moment when we think of these historical figures, historical actors, ancestors who we're remembering who were uncomfortable for a lifetime? And so if it leads us to a better understanding of truth, a better understanding of ourselves, and the opportunity for healing, is it okay to be uncomfortable long enough to get that better understanding, and stay committed to the conversation
Mm.
and the opportunities for engagement, in a way that moves us forward, together, because I truly believe we're stronger together. And so the data work, the community engagement, and that willingness for me is how we get there. It's how this generation creates change. And so that's where my question is can we manage that discomfort long enough to move forward?
I love that. What a wonderful place to wrap up. I mean, the way that across this podcast you both have raised the deep complexity of inheritance is just there's so much to think about. I have to go teach in an hour and a half. I'm going to be thinking about this all day. My students are probably going to be like, "Wait, why did you change the topic?" But this has just been really, really fantastic. I was looking forward to the conversation, and this has been, even better than I had hoped for. So, thank you both for your time and thoughtfulness, but also thank you for this project and the way the project's practice, not just the idea of the project, but the project's practice really puts a challenge to all of us. I don't care what we do as activists, artists, scholars. You really put such important, difficult questions to us. So thank you for that.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank
Thank you for
you.
having us.
Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Bye bye.